stuck with about 13 out of 15. Algeria, Burundi, Botswana, Chile, China, Colombia, Egypt, Guyana, India, Indonesia, Liberia, Mexico, Nigeria, Pakistan, Romania, USSR, Turkey, Yugoslavia, Zambia. I don't know how many did I get. 14. That's one missing. I'm sorry.
Did a good job alphabetically. Remember that. All right. Does the UN have the authority to bring? Yes. Does the UN have the authority to bring UN armed troops against the illegally occupied troops there? And if so, what consideration have they along these lines?
The UN Security Council has the right to declare that the situation in Namibia is a threat to international peace. And once it has declared that, it may then take any one of a number of actions. It may embargo arms, it may conduct an economic embargo, it may call for armed intervention, it may do virtually take any kind of action it pleases. But it must do this by two-thirds vote, and there must be no veto by any of the 5 big powers.
I want to go back to the neo-colonial series of questions that were raised. What you said it was a philosophical question about educating a new administrative strata to send back into Namibia to run it after the elections. Who is doing the education in Lusaka, and what forms are they? What language is it being done in? How is it being done?
The Namibia Institute has a staff which is largely Namibian, although and almost entirely African, except for a few specialists who come in for short periods of study and training on highly technical matters. The language is English completely. One of the problems which the Namibian government ultimately has to decide is the language problem. It's very obvious that nobody is going to want none of the liberation people are going to want to make Afrikaans the main language. English and Afrikaans are largely the lingua franca of Namibia. They're the 2 languages which are theoretically at least taught in school. English is becoming the language that the missionaries work in, mostly because missionaries try to be universal, and if they choose any one of the languages, local languages, then they are slighting the others. There is also the very important problem that if you want to get books that are already published in the world, you're going to get them in one of half a dozen languages if you want a full library. Otherwise, you have to start the long and arduous process of translating into local languages which do not have technical vocabulary and printing all these things, and the costs are overwhelming. So that as a practical matter, English is probably going to be the language of Namibia, although they of course can decide otherwise. It will be their country to decide, but as a practical matter, it looks as if it would be difficult to. Almost inevitably.
Thank you very much, Dr. Landis. Now we'll take a 15 to 20 minute break. There are refreshments downstairs, and I think you can get some air and away from the heat.
Dr. Landis,
Yes, I'm just about to hand them to you. I'm sorry, I don't think the green ones to go around. Really?
University of Ohio. Dr. Rhodes, will you please take a stand? Dr. Rhodes, will you please state your full name for the record?
My name is Robert Noam Rhodes.
What is your application?
My occupation, I'm a social professor at Ohio.
Any Carter?
Yes, in economic and political science.
Are you familiar with the means, ways foreign capital is used to underdevelop emerging countries?
I studied that to some degree.
Will you please? Well, are you familiar with the means and the ways that foreign capital is used to underdevelop emerging countries?
Yes.
Will you please explain to the grand jury the techniques which are used to underdevelop emerging countries and what the concept of the effect of underdevelopment on those emerging countries?
Right. Firstly, the whole approach to the export of capital to underdeveloped countries has to take into consideration not only its technical side, but its socio-economic side, and that capital is a social relation. Capital being a social relation, you would have to examine the substance of the social relation in third world countries as opposed to the substance of social relations in developed countries. We know that there was considerable export of capital to the United States, for instance, in the 19th century, and it resulted in our development. But it had something to do with the nature of the socio-economic reforms that had taken place within the country, namely the agrarian reforms and the nature of labor. So the social relation of capital is used to make money, but it's also a relationship between wage, labor, and capital. Now, one of the characteristics of the relationship in third world countries, especially prior to the most recent period, that is the post-war period, is the fact that one of the characteristics of colonial relations of production is that you had pre-capitalist relations of production and capitalist relations of exchange. And thus you had the worst of all possible world, because it resulted in the heightened alienation of the product from the producer. And the essential social relation was not the relationship between wage, labor, and capital in the traditional way, but metropolitan capital and colonial labor. You can see this especially attested to in Namibia by the distorted form of labor, the contractual labor, long-range contracts. These are the forms of labor during the periods of transition of early capitalism. I'm connected with this. One thing, and this is something that we have to deal with the transfer of technology, which is a productive force, to countries that do not have well-developed social labor. The result of that is that the productive force becomes a destructive force, and thus it accelerates the country on a descending line of development. And this is how underdevelopment took place in the social substance of society. And you can predict that this will happen in Namibia, in particular, and it has already happened to some degree. There were some notions that the export of capital will at least lay the material substance for some development. But we had this very rapid export of capital to Namibia in the 60s, but this was for the purpose of laying the infrastructure, and it had some labor-intensive qualities. Now the new capital coming in from multinational or transnationals will be capital-intensive. This is going to mean that large number of laborers in Namibia, more and more of them will be pushed out of the dominant socio-economic processes of the neo-colonial type economy. And this is the variant that is proposed even by the recent Carter overture. Coupled with this, we see sometimes called the Brazilian model of development. And we notice in the Brazilian model of development, even in Brazil, that after many years of rapid growth, 60% of the population is still involved in subsistence economy and subject to approaching genocidal conditions. Now this has this accelerated, and I think that this neocolonial variant, especially in Namibia, has actually genocidal implications. I think too short shrift was given to the Carter proposal that was put forth in the paper today and also mentioned in the Washington Post, because this is laying the, what shall we say, the infrastructure of support. I suspect this money might go to tribal chiefs to develop a parasitic landlord class. But given the fact that if it was successful, but the tribal structure has been broken down by the colonial relations, what would happen, it would prevent the consolidation of the nation, and it would promote ethnic contradictions with diminishing land and labor, and unfertile land and labor. This would, if it was successful, this neo-colonial type capital would eventually lead to strife in the country. So what do you have? You have, the new thinking is that some people thought that there would be an extension of capitalist type relationship into the third world as a result of this flow. But our experience now, we will have to review that in view of the multi-form or multi-structured nature of societies, especially in Africa, that the capital will not flow from one sector to the another, but will lead to conflict between the traditional sector, the subsistence economy, and one sector will actually aggress upon the other sectors. We have had some experience in the problem of how to work out relationships in multi-structure societies, which I'm sure some of our SWAPO friends are quite conversant with, namely that the capital would have to be predominantly in the public sector, the state sector, and elements of planning will have to be introduced rather than market determination, so that the sectors will not spontaneously enter into clashes. So this is something, and I know some of you have heard of the notion of growth without development, in which there is a growth in the magnitude of value accompanied by the destruction of the substance of value, namely the quality of social labor. And this only can happen if you have accompanying that what is known as fictitious accumulation, not real capital formation within the framework of the country, but backed by the credit debt structure, and thus the mode of appropriation of surplus would be external and a heightened role of the banks. And I think too much passing attention was given, I think, to the role of the banks, especially Chase Manhattan and National City, the American representative, but also in keep this high capital intensive mining, of course, might lead to the rise of a labor aristocracy strategy. And formerly the labor aristocracy as a social strategy was an effort to expand the basis of reaction by involving not just, compradors and so forth, but sections of the working class in a relative privileged position. This, of course, is an interim strategy tried already in Latin American countries and is a transitional form to fascism in some instance. The most notable example of this is the strategy in Argentina around Juan Perón. So these are some of the things we had to work for. At first, we thought that the strategy would involve the export of surplus unemployed labor from metropolitan countries. But I think and that's something that we could think about if we could embolden our trade union movement, that the trade union movement in Europe has reacted against this, as attested by the Geneva Conference in 1973 of the World Trade Union Movement, World Federation of Trade Unions, International Confederation of Free Trade Unions, and the World Catholic labor unions, representing over 200 million organized workers, oppose this particular strategy of the export of capital and also the export of unemployed labor from Europe. And this was, unfortunately, there were no American representatives of the trade union movement at this particular conclave. And so I think there might be an alteration of the strategy, not only as attested by the production sharing agreements envisaged by Peter Drucker, and I think you should note also that I'm just tossing out some things so you can ask me some questions in 10 minutes. What can you do? And the Diebold Corporation consulting firm on Wall Street has a new recommendation which is against the national interests of the Namibian people and also against the national interests of the American people. And it envisages the transfer of semi-skilled and unskilled jobs to the third world, the industrialization of the third world in a distorted form, and the development of a veritable monocultural industry accompanied by a deceleration of the growth of the economy in the developed capitalist countries. This is a strategy not only of U.S. capital, but Japanese and West German capital in this area. And I propose, I do not want to intervene on my friend's discussion, but it will have a disastrous effect on poor, semi-skilled, and unskilled labor in the United States. And it ties right into the ethnic question and the nationality question in the United States and the possibilities for blacks to get jobs, especially. I have some interest in that. But this is a strategy not only for in the United States, but Diebold made this recommendation even for Western Europe. Instead of having the guest workers from Turkey, etc., come to Western Europe, we will set up the plants in these areas. So this is the effort to develop a new neo-colonialist international division of labor. As Thiago Nico, one of the experts on this, said, for all the varieties of means and methods, the third world, if this process takes place, will be transformed from a raw material appendage of the metropolitan countries to a part of the structure of the metropolitan economy. And this will result, this is a form of organization of international division of labor in this, the fourth stage of the general crisis of imperialism. General crisis in which imperialism is now on a decided descending line of development, and whose major features is stagflation, the phenomenal form of the descending line of development in all socioeconomic formations. Thank you very much.
Great. Well, I have one question, but my first, well, I would rather just have you speak for another 5 minutes, but I have a question that might help to develop one of the area of discussion. I'm interested maybe for some more discussion on the effect of this export or accelerated export of capital on the economy, the metropolitan economy. You mentioned that one aspect was possibly the export, or one of the strategies, Diebold strategies, I guess, had been the export of low-skilled, semi-skilled jobs to the developing country. But what else, what other changes do you anticipate in the economic profile of the metropolitan country?
Well, firstly, I think in Western Europe, I think that through the strategy of struggle for advanced democracy, that I think they will, they have opposed this strategy, especially the trade union movement, because the strategy is against the interests of the majority of people in the metropolitan country. Unfortunately, we do not, as of yet, have not moved beyond, or I don't know sometime whether we're in the general democratic stage of the struggle. But some of them are trying fitfully to move to the advanced democratic reforms. The cure to it, there are three variables in general that to counter this strategy. That is a program of radical democratic reforms in your metropolitan countries, an expansion of relationship with, to quote Mr. Pompidou, with the socialist countries with their over 1 billion customers. And number three, the support of the struggle of the third world for the restructuring of the international economic order. Now, the strategy is not to break off relationships, as one of the other witnesses attest, it is not to break off relationships with the metropolitan countries, but to restructure them. But see, the thing is, you cannot restructure your international relations unless you restructure your national relations. And the whole pattern of non-equivalent exchange, which is the alternative to this, is of course mutually beneficial ties, which will accelerate the rate of growth of the metropolitan countries. So it seems reasonable to undertake this particular activity. Of course, it will accelerate the rate of growth, but it will not accelerate the growth of the rate of profit. So the essence of a descending line of development is when there is an absolute contradiction between the rate of growth and the rate of profit. And that's why in this, that the transnationals or undertake policies which are unpatriotic, which are anti-national. And that's why I said earlier it's against the national interest. But it will be disastrous for the United States, for instance, in terms not only of the racial problems, but the possibility of the regrowth of regionalism in this country and its effect upon the whole climate in the United States. It is against our interests, in other words, narrowly conceived, or broadly conceived.
Yeah. Another question?
About to form OPEC, for example.
Right.
The developing countries. Now, when they get together to form this, will that have any bearing, or would it change the relationship in relation to the metropolitan countries exploiting these developing countries still?
Right. Of course, OPEC is a very interesting example. Some people call it an anti-imperialist cartel, which seemingly is a contradiction in terms. But there is proposal to do that in regard to various others, like the CPEC or the copper producing. And if that's generalized, that is a partial solution to the problem and a stage in the process of the restructuring of the international economic order. But there is a possibility of it being limited and the struggle whether it will lead to the liberalization of it. But that is correct. It's a partial solution to the problem in that it will mainly solve the problem of deterioration of terms of trade through its proposed indexation of relationship between raw material prices and manufacturing prices. But still, the OPEC arrangement is a necessary element, but not sufficient unless you have parallel to that the internal radical democratic reforms. And you can see that.
While we're on the subject of the decline of imperialism, could you talk a little bit more about what, at one point you characterized as the fourth stage of the decline of imperialism,
What stage is the general crisis?
Exactly.
Right. Well, there's four. Obviously, there must be three more. The first stage of the general crisis arose in 1913, 1929, and there's a substance to them. And some people demarcate it by political phenomena, and others by economic. And second stage, 29 to 57, 58, it was somewhat elongated because of World War II. And we had a very short third stage. And that was ended possibly in 1969. Some people said 1971 with Nixon, when the Bretton Woods Agreement broke apart. But the fourth stage some of the, I lean toward 1969. One feature of it is that the war economy no longer stimulates the economy. And so we are past that stage where we can use the permanent war economy as a solution. So that's why you have certain splits at the top of our society, as Watergate attests. And so there's a new strategy. At each stage, there's a new strategy in regard to the third world, a new strategy in regard to metropolitan economies, and a new strategy in regard to the socialist countries, because the socialist countries have gone through several stages too. They went through the socialism in one country. In 1945, they became a system, and in recent years, with the comprehensive integration plan, they are at another stage in that they have an international planning, which takes, so you have that happening too, but what is happening is that maybe the first world has become the second world. But anyhow, and so that's why you have to make a historic compromise with the third world. And that's why you should not do a mere quantitative analysis of the Carter proposal, which might be laid the political superstructure for a new approach to Namibia. His $100 million proposal might be seed money, as they call it in the bureaucracy, and I'm sure we have a few bureaucrats here in Washington. Yeah. But this is the fourth stage, and we've been in it for some time. It's characterized by slow rates of growth. You remember W.W. Rothstill's article in the Wall Street Journal, caught by Kondratiev. The Kondratiev wave, they're expecting slow rates of growth. Instead of growing at 5.2% rate of growth, as we did in the previous stage, for the system as a whole, the rate of growth will be 3% a year on aggregate, good years and bad years. All you have to do is take the real index of industrial production since 1967. Index industrial production is 135. We've grown 35% in industrial production in 10 years. And if you know, which is less than 3% if you compound it. So we're already in it, you know. And it's really something because sometimes I've been in the Black Liberation Movement, and you listen to Malcolm X, Martin Luther King, and all of a sudden it hits you that they're like Claude McKay. They're from another period of history. But, you know, social consciousness usually trails social being.
I recall after the international reaction after the Sharpeville massacre, there was such a reaction to that it almost really toppled the government at that time. There was in the months following about March 1960, there was a withdrawal of at least $225 million in funds out of South Africa in investment. And the American appeal was made by, I forget the clown's name at that time, Oppenheimer, right, whatever his name was.
He's still around.
Okay, to American banks.
Right.
To bail him out.
Right.
And I think they made a loan of something like $30 million to the Anglo-American Corporation, which was the largest monopoly in South Africa at that time. And oh, okay, right.
This is the last one.
Okay. So the question is, the American banks definitely played a part in saving South Africa at that time when it was close to tumbling. What part do they continue to play? How valuable are they to its continued survival? And could they survival if American bank support and loans were totally cut off?
The banks are central. The role of the banks, not only American banks, I read in the Shashaba that West Germany has passed up the United States and Great Britain in South Africa in investments now. But the heightened role of the financial system in not only Southern Africa but in the third world in general, the predominant form of appropriation of surplus value now is through interest, not only in the third world but in the United States. But the point is that it seems paradoxical with that super exploitation of neocolonial labor that they would need financial assistance, but they have a problem. One of the so-called knot of apartheid contradictions is in their structure of production in their societies. Even though they are able to appropriate a lot of surplus value. They can't realize it in a sale. And so they constantly need financial assistance. And this is aggravated by their militarization. And so, and the not of a party contradiction is why that they're considered a beachhead. And while one of the other witnesses' notions about the using up of the resources of Namibia and the need for South Africa to economically annex Southern Africa. She was envisaged as, in quotation mark, the gendarme of the region. And that's and the gendarme nation does not benefit from their military activity. And so that's why they always need financial support.
Our next witness is going to be Ted Lockwood. He's the director of the Washington Office on Africa, and he's going to talk about the role of tax credits and the way in which the U.S. tax laws work to avoid the clear implications of the law with regard to Namibia. I'm going to instruct the grand jurors that we are talking about Namibia, and each question must relate to something which a witness has testified about, because we want to keep it within that framework. Thank you.
We've been hearing a good deal tonight about how AMAX is conducting its operations in Namibia and how they affect the Namibian struggle for independence. There is another aspect of their operation that affects us in the United States, and that is the role that the United States government plays in enabling AMAX to invest in Namibia and the cost that we as American citizens pay for that. The State Department has always talked with pride about its policy toward Namibia. The United States has supported some resolutions at the UN urging South Africa to get out of Namibia, but its policy is primarily to engage in a kind of mild form of lectures. It has blocked efforts to put pressure, real pressure on Namibia to leave by refusing to support any form of sanctions against South Africa. Even an arms embargo, which it claims to be enforcing unilaterally, the United States will not support as a mandatory action at the United Nations. The United States accepted in 1971 the opinion of the International Court of Justice that South Africa's occupation of Namibia was illegal. And after that, the State Department announced that it would be official policy to discourage further investment in Namibia by American corporations. State Department representatives will tell you that if anybody asks whether or not they should invest in Namibia, they inform him that the official policy is one of discouragement. And then it will explain that the United States will not protect the investment or finance exports or imports with Namibia through the Exim Bank. In this way, the United States claims that it is doing everything it can to discourage investment in order that investment will not strengthen the illegal regime. But there is one loophole which I want to refer to. And it's a rather major loophole because AMAX has profited from it to the tune of millions of dollars every year. American Metal Climax and all American companies that operate in Namibia can take credit for the amount of taxes that they pay to the illegal South African administrators of Namibia. They can take that as a credit against the taxes that they would otherwise owe to the United States government. This is how it works. In 1970, for example, AMAX paid $14 million into the South African treasury in Pretoria. This represented 1/3 of their profits from the Tsumeb mine. When AMAX then computed the taxes that it owed to the United States Internal Revenue Service on its worldwide profits, it could subtract the entire $14 million. This meant that AMAX made $14 million more in profits than it would have otherwise. And without this credit, mining in Namibia would certainly be considerably less profitable because the tax rate would be 83% instead of 50%. It also means that you and I and other American citizens paid $14 million more in taxes that year for the social services that we wanted to have in the defense budget that we didn't want to have. And that tax revenue doesn't go that far. The people who benefit from this tax credit policy then are AMAX and its stockholders and the South African government. The people who lose are the Namibian people and us. It could be argued, I think, that we shouldn't pick up on the tax credit issue, because after all, the United States has a reciprocal agreement with almost every other industrialized nation to allow for tax credits to avoid double taxation. But there are two serious weaknesses with this argument. The first of them deals with Namibia and its peculiar legal status. In 1972, the Nixon Treasury Department made a specific finding that companies could take credit for taxes paid to South Africa for their operations in Namibia. They were asked for a ruling by Congressman Diggs, and Treasury based its ruling on two main points. First, the administration pointed out that Section 901 of the Internal Revenue Code that allows for tax credits had been previously interpreted so as to allow companies to take a credit for taxes paid to a government which the United States didn't recognize, such as, for example, the People's Republic of China or Nazi Germany during World War II. And so they claimed that if the United States allowed a tax credit for South African taxes, it had nothing to do with the fact that Namibia's, the occupying power, South Africa, is illegally there. It has nothing to do with that. Secondly, the Treasury ruled that a foreign tax should be credited even if it's imposed on income that wasn't all earned inside the taxing country, namely South Africa. Even if the tax was completely outside South Africa's jurisdiction, had no business doing it, nevertheless, the tax should be credited. However, the bilateral tax agreement between the United States and South Africa does not provide for any kind of tax credit on income that has its source outside the country involved. The tax credit issue was decided purely on a technical ground in terms of the Internal Revenue Code. One ground on which the administration and the new administration, if it really wanted to, could reverse the ruling is this. Allowing tax credits for taxes paid on Namibian incomes, I would say, is contrary to public policy. The United States public policy is to discourage investment, at least that's what they say, strengthen South Africa's illegal administration in Namibia. South Africa has worked very hard for people to find out
revenues because of the subsidization of the export of capital is really a minor loss compared to the larger losses the economy suffers. We lose directly through the flight of capital abroad between 150,000 and 200,000 jobs a year, although that number is very, very difficult to measure. Moreover, our tax bases suffer. Firms use their multinationalization or their transnationalization to hide their profits. I saw a statement made earlier that $14 million in taxes were paid on $42 million of profit. That number, $42 million, can't be correct. I see the number that the Tsumeb mine, 1970, produced $26 million in profit. That's probably a gross underestimation. The firms that are operating these enterprises operate in several different product lines and several different stages of production in several different countries. So they simply take the product out of Namibia, they move it up through the line of ownership to a tax-free port, Panama, Bermuda, Hong Kong, and they declare the profit there. They up the value of the price, and then they sell it to an American or a European or a Japanese parent company, and the profit occurs in the tax-free port. And virtually all nations lose revenue to global corporations in this fashion. All localities in the United States lose revenues because they have to compete with each other to give tax concessions to enterprises for jobs. So there are a large number of losses associated with this sort of multinationalization of the world's wealth, and the fact that the world's productive system is in fact coming under one rule. The direct losses associated with this sort of subsidy are several $billion a year. That's because of the tax credit given, because of the services of the Agency for International Development, because of American contributions to the World Bank. Moreover, there's now the possibility that the United States is going to have to subsidize in some way, shape, or form an international chain of banking failure, because American multinational banks have, from a banking sense, in an imprudent way, lent money to developing nations who have to finance massive deficits in their trade because they're hooked on American technology and through the royalty and patent system. What could be done with this money instead? One thing we could do to tie it directly to the situation we're dealing with is put it into a new international economic order, such as that recommended by the United Nations Conference on Trade and Development. That in fact we could use that to subsidize the development of indigenous technology and local production facilities in the third world, right? And then we could eliminate the necessity of having an international division of labor where the United States does the sort of on-paper production and the rest of the world does the real production. The United States does the banking. Right? We could do that. That could take the funds. There are several other national projects that require doing in the United States. There's an incomplete health system. There's an incomplete system of income maintenance. I brought with me, I'll be pleased to distribute at the end of this testimony, just a brief overall statement of the federal budget by category and by type of expenditure. But through the kind of finagling that we've talked about, American corporations have reduced their share of income taxes paid from 24% of the budget to 12% in the last 20 years. And they've necessitated large classes of expenditures. We're spending $111.9 billion apparently in this fiscal year to maintain an army, which is in fact a worldwide police system, for the security of this American, or let's now call it global wealth, with some sort of American parentage, right, that's now sort of encircling the world. The fact that we spend $146 billion on income security is to a large extent necessitated by the fact that there is a global system of production. The United States is going to play a decreasing role in it, that the United States is being underdeveloped as a country, that the international system of economics in fact conceals an international system of power, and that power no longer plays into the hands of the United States. Right? That it, like all other nations, is going to fall into a subsidiary position to the managers of the global economy, who could be captured very quickly in the largest 1,200 global corporations, which now account for 1/2 of the world's cash transactions. I think I'd like to kind of let it go right here and go into questions and see if we can move this along. I've wondered about this, and I suppose it is true. I used to think that there were purely domestic sorts of sectors. It always occurred to me that agriculture would be a domestic sector, but now you see things like the component parts of Big Macs are raised in Latin America. Right? The people of Chile have no food, but they just received a $60 million loan from the World Bank to grow some very fancy form of scallop, to harvest it off the Pacific shores, and to send it north for cash so they can pay for the interest payments to Citicorp and to Chase and the Rockefeller people. So it's not a domestic sector. Almost a half of the component parts of the American military sector are produced abroad, right, through farming out contracts by multinational corporations. So it's very, very difficult, except for local industries that operate purely a peripheral position in the economy, to say that there is an American business structure. There's a worldwide business structure. A lot of it sprang from the brow of the American economy, but it's certainly not American. It is of and for itself. Oh, the Agency for International Development takes everybody to the third world the way a maitre d' takes everybody to the table at a restaurant. It was set up to promote this sort of investment and does that in virtually every third world country except for those that have thrown it out. Right? And what's interesting is that the agency was formed in a way because the government was more concerned about the export of capital than the corporations were. That the government was eager to promote American outposts of business, which they thought would bring political stability to the world after the Second World War, when there was this serious threat of the Soviet Union invading every country on earth, making them all speak Russian. And whatever else I was told as a very young person. But it certainly is, and it certainly consciously plans, in conjunction with the global corporations, exactly what role any one individual nation is going to play. They do marketing forecasts, they do surveys as to what sectors need expansion, and effectively they're an information gathering arm for the global corporations.
As an insider in American politics, as you are relatively speaking, could you tell an outsider like myself whether or not the issues you've described here, in the terms you've described them, are discussed in the hallowed halls of American Congress? And if so, what kind of response do they get?
To a surprising extent, particularly insofar as the multinationalization of business has made America lose its sovereignty. It's no longer possible for the federal government to conduct the normal economic operations that it conducts to modulate the economy. It's impossible for the Federal Reserve Bank to expand the monetary supply of the country without the global corporations interfering. It's impossible to create jobs by giving people $50. We found that out. It's also impossible to create jobs by giving them $100 or even $200. Because the money ends up being funneled into the wealth machine of these largest 1,000 global corporations in the Fortune 500 of the United States. So there is that sort of concern. I don't think that very many members understand that the global corporations are going to create the need for effectively a worldwide economic planning mechanism to turn this entire thing around. And I think that one of the structural changes that Dr. Rhodes was talking about is the fact that there's going to have to be some form of formal planning in the United States economy, and that one of the next major political battles we're going to face in the Congress and in the nation is who's going to control that, who's going to decide what's going to be produced and how it's going to be produced and who's going to get it.
Thank you very much, Mr. Everett. I'm sorry. Our next witness will be Ellen Chapnick. Ms. Chapnick is a former legal counsel for the United Mine Workers. She will present to us a case study for Amex Corporation. Ms. Chapnick. Maybe we can just turn things down for a moment until she arrives. Here she comes down. Please take the stand. Ms. Chapnick, will you please state your name for the record?
Yes, my name is Ellen Chapnick.
And what was your previous occupation?
I was an attorney at the United Mine Workers of America involved in litigation and contract negotiations. Want me to repeat it?
Yes, please.
I was an attorney at the United Mine Workers of America engaged in litigation and contract negotiations.
During that period of time, did you become familiar with the practices of Amex Corporation?
Yes, I did. I had occasion to negotiate with Amex involving their mine in Bel Air, their Bel Air mine in Gillette, Wyoming.
Will you please inform the grand jury as to the nature of the conditions and that you became aware of as a former legal counsel for the mine workers?
Surely. The Gillette area is in Campbell County, Wyoming. The Amex coal mine is the largest employer in the area. Other than the oil fields, the oil rigs, there are hardly any other industries in that area. You get into the county and you notice a large, vast, open space, antelope running all around, You drive closer into the town of Gillette, and you see trailer camps with trailers packed close together. You later learn that those trailer camps cost $100 a month just to get water and electricity. You later learn that Amex owns those wide open spaces where there aren't any houses, or at least they own the mineral rights, and that one of the reasons of the contrast between the place where people live and the area around it is because even though Amex doesn't plan to develop that land for at least 99 years, they don't want people living there in the meanwhile because they might get in the way. You also notice that there aren't any trees around except for some cottonwoods. And the significance of that is brought home to you later when you find out the cottonwoods grow around water, and the scarceness of the trees signifies the scarceness of the water, and that as the mine expands, the trees die because the water is disappearing. The mine itself is an extraordinarily high productivity mine for a number of reasons. It's a surface mine. It's subbituminous coal. The ratio of overburden to coal is 10 feet to 70 feet, which is the reverse of the ratio in the eastern and midwestern mines. The overburden has little rock, which means that you don't need to blast. It means that you don't need to use drag lines, which are large, expensive, and rare pieces of equipment, so that the mine is not held back in its development by the need for drag lines. You also learn that the coal is shipped out of Bel Air by unit trains, which is a recent development in transportation of coal. It's fast, it's efficient, and all of this goes to making the Bel Air mine the largest coal mine in the United States today, and it will grow even larger. The workforce at the mine is imported from outside the area. At the time I was there, and I spent 5 weeks there in picket line support duty, I met 40 of the workers. 3 had grown up in Campbell County or the surrounding area. Most were imported from outside the area, outside the state. However, unlike other coal companies, they were not imported from Amex's eastern mine, so it wasn't a matter of getting an experienced workforce that they knew that they could trust. It was a matter of collecting people from all over to come into the mine. Most of the people who were working there, this was the best job they had ever had. They were roughnecks on the oil rigs, they were drifters, they were truck drivers, and a good steady job at a high wage was a very important thing in their lives. In addition, these people had no UMWA heritage. They didn't come from coal mining regions. They didn't even come from other union areas. So what we had was a situation that was basically ripe for the plucking. You had a high stakes game from Amex's point of view, and you had a weak union. When the 1971 mine workers contract expired in November 1974, we gave Amex a 90-day extension on the contract because the Progressive Mine Workers, which we consider a company union, had filed a decertification petition, and we didn't want the men to be on strike at the time of the election because we felt we would lose it if they were. We've ultimately won the election. We won substantially, and in January 6, 1975, the men went on strike. Amex, however, was not satisfied. They refused to join a multi-employer bargaining group contrary to their usual practices. They offered a contract proposal substantially below the 1971 levels, and they basically refused to negotiate. After 3 months, they gave us what they considered their final offer. It was an insult. The UMWA rejected it, and 2 weeks later, 1/2 of the workforce crossed the picket line and returned to their jobs. Subsequently, Amex hired a substantial number of strikebreakers who had not previously worked for them, and the strike was effectively broken. Negotiations deteriorated, and even though the union conceded many hard-won gains over the last 20 years in Eastern and Midwestern negotiations as well as Western negotiations, Amex refused to come to an agreement. They used the NLRB, they used the federal courts, they used the injunctions. They bought the town sentiment by making contributions to churches. They ran massive newspaper ad campaigns. There have been no negotiations since February 1976. There was never a contract signed, and another decertification election, which will be held shortly, will result in the decertification of the United Mine Workers. A look at just a couple of the specific contract demands that AMAX refused to meet, I think, shows very clearly what their strategy at AMAX at Bel Air was. All of this has to be viewed against the frustration that came out of sitting across the table from negotiators who considered themselves liberals. You'd raise a safety issue and they'd say, don't taint us with the brush that you taint the other operators with. We're not like that. We have a great safety record. Why, we haven't had anybody die at that mine in the 2 years it's been in operation. And you'd say, well, you know, we have to do reclamation. They'd say, well, we have a subsidiary, Meadowlark Farms, set up just to do reclamation. Why, I don't know why you're doing this stuff to us. And they'd sit there in their earth shoes, and I think AMAX issues earth shoes to its negotiators the day they get employed, and their puka beads, you know, and they'd bop up and down and tell you how great they were. But in the meanwhile, they refused to agree to a common termination date. There isn't a mine worker contract in this country that does not expire on December 6th, 1977. And that's for a very obvious reason. If we can shut down the coal in this country, we can win. AMAX knows that too. And they not only didn't want the Bel Air people to have the strength of their union brothers all over the country, but they wanted to have the Bel Air mine producing coal so that when the national contract strike occurred, they could be flooding the eastern and midwestern markets with western coal. It's not very hard to figure out. Another thing they refused was the UMWA funds. Besides being a very good health and benefit plan, the United Mine Workers has a provision that if you are a mine worker at any UMWA mine in the country and you go to work at another UMWA mine, you take your pension and your health benefits with you. AMAX refused that. And again, it's not too hard to figure out what they did. They were trying to make the employees at the Bel Air mine, which is not a pleasant place to work, captive so that they couldn't take their pension and health benefits with them. And they were also seeking to discourage mine workers from other parts in the country with more militancy, more mine worker consciousness from moving in there because they couldn't bring their pensions and health benefits with them into the Bel Air mine. They had a few other little things. Mine Workers since 1951 has had a clause in its contract that says if you get recognition at any mine owned by an employer during the life of a contract, that contract immediately becomes applied at the new mine. Well, they refused that, and again, it was clear they wanted their mines in the West to be competing against each other, and they wanted to be able to develop one mine at the expense of another. It goes on and on. They refused successorship clause so that they could transfer their mine out to another employer without the contract going with it. They refused subcontracting clauses so that subcontractors wouldn't have to meet mine worker standards. They refused construction clauses, making construction work on the mine site under mine worker jurisdiction. And when we're talking about mine worker jurisdiction, we're talking about union jurisdiction, because out there aren't any other unions that could have taken over these jobs. It goes on and on and on. No recall for laid-off employees, a 7-day week, a 10-hour day. And then they demanded an express no-strike clause, even though there'd never been a strike at the Bel Air mine. In fact, nobody had ever filed a grievance at the Bel Air mine. It goes on and on and on, and I won't go into great detail. And I know a lot of what I'm talking about, a lot of the living conditions and the working conditions after some of the horrors that you've heard earlier tonight, don't sound that awful. But I think you have to view them against the context of what we're talking about here is the United States. We're talking about white male workers. We're not talking about Africa. We're not talking about blacks. And that AMAX knows, they're smart enough to know that they can't get away with some of the things that they can get away with elsewhere. But the connections can be made, and one of the places where they were made was at the SoCal shareholders meeting. It was a special shareholders meeting held by AMAX to discuss the takeover of 20% of their stock by SoCal. And we were there with 6 coal miners from Wyoming to talk about the AMAX situation. And there were a number of church groups and other people there to talk about the Namibia situation. And the meeting was supposed to take 10 minutes, and it was supposed to be an open and shut meeting, and 2.5 hours later, and most of the talking was done by the 2 groups, the meeting ended. And I don't know that any of the shareholders learned anything. I'm sure the board of directors didn't learn anything. But I do know that at the end of that meeting, there were 6 Wyoming coal miners who didn't feel so isolated. And they knew that they had some black brothers that they'd never seen who were in some situations that were even tougher than theirs, and that they had a common enemy.
documents with you?
Yes, I did. For one thing, I brought the transcript of the SoCal shareholders meeting. I also brought a document prepared by the United Mine Workers of America Research Department. We were going to do some litigation to try to prevent the takeover of the stock by SoCal on an antitrust theory. And in the process, the research department prepared a detailed document showing the transfer of leases on the Cheyenne Reservation that involved not only AMAX but SoCal, and it's a detailed chronology of what happened to individual parcels of coal lands.
Are there some additional documents or photographs?
Yeah, we have a number of photographs that show not only the picket line and the mine, but the conditions in Gillette, the living conditions in Gillette, that were taken by mine worker photographers.
And will you make those available to us later?
Certainly will. And whatever other documents that can be found in the files that might be useful.
Okay, any questions? Well, the only comment I can make at this point is that we're an hour and a half behind schedule from what we had planned to be tonight. Ms. Chapnick was our last witness, and rather than start at 9:30 tomorrow morning, we're going to start at 10 o'clock tomorrow morning with the movie, which is In MacArthur Park is the title of it. And it is about a Native American person who is driven from his reservation by a dam that is constructed, destroying his traditional fishing, and the life and difficulty and terror of moving to Los Angeles in another culture and trying to survive in that environment. As it shows one of the adverse impacts that the development of land has on the indigenous people who live on it. And that's it. You do have a question.
Thank you.
What would it take to get the bureaucracy of the United Mine Workers Union, the top people, after what you just described, to come out and say something about AMAX in Namibia? Hold a press conference and put that out to the American newspaper reader or whatever.
Well, I think one of the very tragic things about the United Mine Workers is that it's now in the hands of some people who people thought would be progressive, and people who thought were union reformers, and they're not. And so I think that it wouldn't, no matter what was done right now with the present people in power at the United Mine Workers, nothing would move them to make the necessary connections. And the number of the members of the mine workers right now are much more progressive and much more aware than the top bureaucracy is. And it's one of the reasons why I'm a former attorney at the United Mine Workers.
You mentioned about the fact that out of 40 miners that you talked to personally at that Gillette mine, only 3 were like